All right, this is part 22 of the Dark Light series. The tree of knowledge of good and evil represents a total and complete love change shift. This is the crucial change, and it is the change that the entire doctrine of regeneration is geared to resolve. We have shown you that God is a spirit, and a spirit of pure agape love. Because Adam and Eve were created in the image and likeness of God, they too were also of the same pure agape love essence. Agape love is 100% pure. It is imperative you understand this. There are no imperfections in God's love. It is totally pure in the absent sense. There is not one impurity found within it. From this absolute pure agape love flows absolute righteousness, absolute justice, absolute truth, absolute good, absolute morality, and ethics. This means that God's agape love is 100% pure. It is not 99.999, okay, pure, but wholly pure. The fruit contains a knowledge of both good and evil. Because evil is present within the knowledge, the evil is the countermanding force to love and good. Then, if ingested, the purity of agape love would be violated. It would no longer be pure. Therefore, it would no longer be pure, but impure. If by definition divine agape love is absolute impurity, then divine agape love is instantly lost. Agape love is a thing of the past, for now the purity is violated, and it is no longer divine love. It is instead another form of love, a love impure, a love not perfect. As we are dealing with the love not perfect, the love not pure, less than 100% in purity, then man died to pure agape love. It was separated and was separated from it. As the word death means separation, then we would have every right to say that man died to pure agape. He died to purity, but came alive to impurity. He then died to God and then came alive to Satan. He went into spiritual death. The radical knowledge of good and evil brings with it the radical change in impurity. As divine agape love is defined as pure love, then mankind is no longer alive to it. Instantly, his communion with God is severed. Instantly, the knowledge of God he had through union with God is severed. Man dies a spiritual death unto God and God's kingdom. In graph form, it looks like this. Okay, so this is the gulf of silence. This is what they call the sin barrier. And when you're going through this, you end up going through this here. When it says spirit, subconscious, evil, good, conscious mind, okay? Relative righteousness, filial love, that's what you have now. You got to go through the narrow way, and it leads you to pure agape love, life, absolute righteousness, agape love. In order to get there, he calls it the gulf of silence. I call it the abyss. It's the same difference. It's just dark. There's nothing there. Okay. Did God mention any of this to either Adam or Eve? In fact, the fact is he did. But we can also show that Adam or Eve would not be able to comprehend what God was speaking of. They could not comprehend spiritual death anymore than man could comprehend spiritual rebirth until he goes through it. The concept of spiritual death would not mean much to them, for they were alive and had total peace and joy in their hearts. Of what they know of this death, nevertheless, God and his agape love warns them not to partake of this fruit. But the tree of knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou shalt eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. Genesis 2:17. So what did God mean when he said they would die in the very day they partook of this knowledge? The word die, it means to die, to kill, to slay. It is the opposite of life. It is the cessation of life. It means cutting off, a severance, a separation from. The question we have in this is this: from what is man going to die? The answer becomes obvious: from the 100% purity of agape love he was created with. He will die to pure agape love essence. He will be cut off and severed from it. Because God is also pure love, man will be cut off and severed from God. He will be cut off and severed from God in his spiritual essence. He will go from union to communion, which is experiential knowledge of God, to total severance, to real and literally dying to God. Okay, so we can prove that Adam and Eve lived many years after the day they ate of this fruit. But God is not a liar, and he plainly states that both Adam and Eve will die in the very day they eat of this fruit. Obviously, God is speaking of another form of dying and not physical death. This dying will be spiritual. They will die spiritually to God. Their love will no longer be pure, and that impurity brings instant cessation of union. It is also interesting to note that that to God 1,000 years of earth time represent one day. Uh, Peter 3:8, Psalm 94. 94. Okay, Adam lived for 935 years and died. Genesis 5:5. We are not told how long Eve lived, but we know it was not over 1,000 years. From God's point of view, then, both Adam and Eve did die in the day they ate of the fruit. But the primary message being given to us is that of spiritual death due to the loss of pure agape love essence. The love change went from pure agape to what the Bible calls filial love. The love of man changes from agape to another form of love, which we could call natural love, the love we were born with. Standing behind filial love is God's agape in its very twisted form. It is a perverted agape, a relative agape, primarily referred to in Scripture simply as phileo. The Greek lists over 19 forms of filial love. They have a form of phi in them, phi. They include love of good men, brotherly love, love of brethren, fond of the brethren, fraternal love, fond of man, affectionate as a wife loves her husband, fondness for mankind, benevolence, kindness, love towards man, fondly to men, humanely, courteously, love of money, love of self, selfish, lover of own self, to have affection for, and the personal attachment for, a matter of sentiment and feeling, fond of pleasure, lover of pleasure, voluptuous, a giving of a kiss, friendly, amiable, fondness of friendship, and it goes on and on. You can read it right there if you'd like. Just go ahead and pause the recording. The Greek words convey the spectrum of the filial loves of fallen natural man. They were the various forms of natural love that all humans have in one degree or another. The vast majority of Christians who were sent away rejected of Christ all had these natural loves of man beating within their breasts. Mankind is under the deception that filial love released is in fact the agape love of God. They do what Peter did. They equate love as love. In other words, filial love is agape love, and certain forms of filial love is agape love. If we were to take scale of morality of good and evil and then apply filial love to it, we would then see the following relative righteousness scale. So love not present, I am, heart, moral, ethic, people. Love present, released. Notice the filial love released, that is, acts of love towards others, goes hand in hand with being moral and ethical. The more love we release, the more love prompts us to do. The higher up we climb on the relative righteousness scale. In other words, the more we love in action, the more man thinks of us in terms of being righteous, of being highly moral, of being totally and sincerely ethical. We could say the more godlike we become. To coin a new age phrase, we become points of light. I see that all the time. It's complete garbage. It's a new age phrase. You know, they're all trying to become godlike. We can have the God within us and all this crap. Mother Teresa is a very good example of this type of soul, of a point of light. She has turned her back upon the world and turned wholly and totally to works of filial love. She is considered a shining example of what man ought to be. She is considered by many to be godlike. She is a leader in the New Age movement and is present at many New Age meetings. but is she a reality godlike? Do her deeds earn her any respect in the eyes of God? On the other side of the scale, we quickly realize that love not released in acts of kindness quickly degenerates into works of evil. Not only is their sort of a soul unloving or neutral, they engage in overt acts of anger, hostility, and rage. They act out their violent aggression on their victims in the very opposite of love. We rate them on a scale of 1 to 10 on the negative side or evil side of neutral. We quickly conclude that love not released equates to evil. It becomes apparent that the man rates morality and ethics and reality on a love released scale. In love release, the more acts of love done, the higher the score in points. So Mother Teresa is the number 10. Ted Bundy, on the other hand, is a minus 10. All the world religions, including Christianity, claim that love is the only force capable of holding man together in peace and brotherhood. If man would but love in deed and in truth, he would somehow navigate himself around disaster. The New World Order of George Bush and company is a last-ditch effort to find a way to get man to release his own natural love. The trouble with all this is based upon natural filial loves of mankind. Our scale of morality is based upon filial love, relative love, and relative righteousness. The pure agape love of God is nowhere to be found in this scale. There is a giant gulf that separates man from God, and what separates God from this scale is the relative righteousness of man. God is absolute, he is total righteousness. Therefore, in the end, if a soul were to score a perfect filial love release all of their life, they are still in filial love, not in agape. This is precisely why Paul said, you could give away all that you own to the poor, all that you have had or and are, and you could pour your very life for Christ, and it will not avail yourself of salvation. It will not, for one simple reason. All of these works were done in natural filial love. God is not a perfect love in the filial scale. It is not that he does not have perfect filial love, but he sits upon another higher scale, the scale of absolute pure agape love. In point of fact, we should not call it a scale, for a scale is used to measure. There's nothing to measure about God's perfect love. It is always absolute. In point of fact, we will prove that mankind hates the agape love of God and does not even view it as love at all, but instead as a form of evil. Christ was pure agape love in the flesh. He was hated and killed because man could not tolerate pure agape love. It immediately points out the lie of our human love, the inability of man to even love in filial love, let alone agape. For example, let us say that we have a bucket of gray paint. We'll say it's a medium gray. Through the years, man teaches people that this gray paint is in fact white. He grows accustomed to this gray as being called white and accepts it as white. He declares his gray paint as pure white and comes to believe it, embrace it as a truth. Then someone comes along with a real pure white paint. The gray becomes dark by comparison. The owner of this newly formed paint begins to sell it on the basis that his so-called white of the competition is a lie, a fraud, and what they have been selling the public is not white. It never was, and in fact, they knew it. They knew it all along. This would kill the paint manufacturer's business. They would have been. I'm sorry, they've been exposed. The general public is smarter than you think. You can fool some of the people some of the time, but most of the people the part of the time, but not all the people all the time. They wake up sooner or later to the lies and the deception. The paint manufacturers get together and decide they must kill off their competitor. If they do not, they will be ruined. They buy up all the real white paint and kill off the individual that brought it to the world. That is the story of Jesus Christ. He brought with him a pure white paint and told us that our paint was dark gray. The religious men of the world had been selling gray paint dressed up in the works of righteousness as white paint. They became whitewashed sculptors. They took their works of filial love, released and claimed it. It was pure white paint of agape love. They painted themselves with it, thinking that it would fool God and fool the people. It may have fooled the vast majority of people, but it did not fool God at all. When they came before God, he sent his angels to get some real tough stripper called truth, for he knew that if it was indeed agape love, it would stand up to anything. It was impervious to damage. The angels came and slapped slapped on the stripper, and lo and behold, their so-called agape love white paint melted, and their filial love gray paint was exposed to the light of the truth. They were liars, frauds, and hypocrites, claiming that their filial love deeds were in fact the agape love of God. Woe unto you, the scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like unto white sculptures, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and all of uncleanliness. We must remember that Jesus told us in the Sermon on the Mount, for I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now, people will read that particular thing right there that, oh, you have to do good. You have to do good all the time, and that will get you into heaven. That would be false. The scribes and Pharisees were law keepers to a fine degree. They had over 600,000 laws, 600 plus laws, that they had to keep without fail. This law keeping is what made them righteous. It was their bucket of white paint. Christ is telling us that unless we exceed that ability, we cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven. What does he mean? He means that it is utterly impossible to enter heaven by any form of law keeping or any other attempts to justify ourselves before God. All forms of works or legalism are done away with under Christ. They are to no avail. The only way Christ gave us is via the strait gate and narrow way, which leadeth unto life, agape love bestowment. And it is via the free gift of the agape love of Christ that we enter heaven. The strait gate and narrow way are not works or legalism. It is not by any means an attempt to justify yourself before God, but rather the very reverse is a method used to bring the soul to agreement with God from his heart of hearts. You must understand that gray paint is gray paint, and you calling it white, do not change it, okay? Filial love is filial love and is not agape love, no matter what your claims may be to the contrary. Works of righteousness or law keeping do not change the heart, and new covenant, or the new covenant, may only be entered by the supernatural heart change. From filial love, a heart of stone, to agape love, a heart of flesh. The scribes and Pharisees are no different than the vast majority of Christians who walk around doing all these good works, but they do not do them all in filial love and refuse to walk the narrow way to find true agape love. They claimed that their natural love released was the agape love of God. They claimed that all they had to do was make a decision for Christ, which was a reality, a decision to love. For Christ is love. They totally ignored the difference between agape love and filial love. Mankind is on the filial love plane of life. He knows no other form of love. He is trapped by the virtue of the knowledge of good and evil. He can reach a level of 10 plus or plus 10 on the plane relative righteousness of filial love, but he is still under filial love. All of his religion and all of his deeds, good deeds, all of his efforts to prove God that he is capable of some good ends up in disaster. The law of agape love prevails thus. Filial love deeds, here's you go right over here, eternal damnation await. Narrow way, the gulf, and he calls it the gulf here. I call it the abyss. And then absolute love, absolute righteousness found only in Christ, eternal life. That's very, very, very true. All right. You will notice that God is not on the filial love relative righteousness scale. He is not there because he is not on there because he is pure agape love. He sits way over totally out of the reach of man, separated by a giant gulf. a giant chasm of silence and invisibility. Yeah, it's quiet. That which separates man from God is the straight gate and narrow way. He is apart and unknowable to natural man, unless and until he walks the way. The tree of knowledge of good and evil brought instant spiritual death, cessation, and severance from God. God is separate, simply not knowable by mankind in his present state. He is a fallen creature who operates on a plane of imperfect filial love. All of the human love in the world released would not jump this gigantic gulf between man and God. Satan, on the other hand, will pour out lying signs and wonders in an attempt to prove to man that his own natural filial love released is the agape love of Christ and God. He will subvert any Christian theology in an attempt to prove that this is so. He will invent a million religions in an effort to sidetrack man into the works of righteousness, all done via the release of filial love. The very platform of Antichrist is filial love of man released. It is, as I have stated before, the root of the grand delusion. From this root deception spring in all other deceptions, and every one of them will attempt to prove that filial love released is the agape love of God. All that man needs to do, says the Antichrist spirit, is to realize that the love he has within is of God. Man and his delusion will go one step further. He will declare that the love he has within is God. He will then release it and declare himself God. That is all the delusion, all the deception. We've heard this over and over. I see this crap all the time, everywhere. That's what's going to be that's the downfall, okay, of man. There is a reality, a gigantic gulf between the most perfect of filial love and the agape love of God. They are wholly different from each other. They stem from different roots. The filial love of man stems from the root of selfishness. We will see why this is so shortly. The agape love of God stems from the root of selfishness. The two concepts are in reality diametric opposites. There's no compatibility. For one flows inward, the other flows outward. It is satanic deception that the filial love of man flows outward, because at the root of why it is given is to obtain something in return. Filio versus agape. Okay, these can flow out, all those flow in. Okay, the gulf that separates man from God is called by theologians the sin barrier. It is in reality an agape love barrier. It is an utter lack, utter destitution of man in the agape love area that erects a barrier between man and God. In reality, there are two barriers between man and God. One barrier is the barrier erected by God because of sin due to lack of agape love, and the other barrier is erected by man against God because of his natural rebellion and hatred of God. This hatred and rebellion is aided and abetted by Satan, who took literal dominion over man at the fall. Spiritual death means what it says, total severance from God at the root of heart of man. He not only does not know God, he does not not love God. In point of fact, he hates God and seeks to kill God, just as those that believed upon Christ tried to stone him to death. Agape love lost is spiritual death. We shall later prove this out in a multitude of scripture. And I'm just tell you right now, he's absolutely correct. So when people say, "Oh, God is on my side," you're at war with him. You just don't know it. And you gotta realize that, see it, and ask him to turn it around. That's what needs to happen. Christ removed the barrier that God erected against man by his work upon the cross. The other barrier, the rebellion barrier, is of the inner heart, remains in full force and effect. This barrier is what modern Christianity theology ignores totally. In most cases, declares does not even exist. In their new plan of salvation, they ignore and bypass this barrier, claiming that the work of Christ removed all barriers between man and God. And all that man has to do is understand that and embrace it as an act of faith. If we were to view the two barriers, it would look like this. Okay, good and evil phileo. Then you have the evil heart barrier, hostile to God. And then you have the gulf. And then you have the agape love barrier and sin barrier. God, Christ, and Holy Spirit, agape. Um, this is the abyss right here. Okay, the work of Christ upon the cross removed the sin barrier. Okay, that was this one. Evil barrier, hostile to God. All right. God is now reconciled to man via the work of Christ. Now we have only one barrier left. And what does man have to do in order to remove this barrier of rebellion and hostility towards the true God? Jesus told us that what we have to do: enter the straight gate and walk the narrow way to the death. Okay, there's this one right here. We must undergo a love change from filio to agape love. And when God has accomplished that, reconciliation and union become an experiential reality to the believer. All barriers are down. It will be proven later that the many held a theology that told them there were no barriers between them and God. They merely had to make a decision for Christ, and this is so called decision. God automatically and instantly granted agape love to that soul. Everything was appropriated by an act of faith, an act of belief. Faith became salvation itself. Faith became Christ himself. Their theology cost them heaven. They embraced it in the whole heart and refuted all the warnings Christ that it was false. Reconciliation will be fully discussed later. But in essential, it is essential you understand that there is a huge barrier between man and God, and it is a filial love rebellion barrier. The tree and godhood. If the fruit of the tree represents the experiential knowledge of both good and evil, then man must and will enter a form of pseudo godhood. It was the claim of Satan to Eve. For God doth know that the day you eat thereof, then your eyes shall be open, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. When in fact what you did turn into was beasts. You became the beast. Got to realize that. That's hard for people to get, that you turned into the beast. That's what he turned Adam and Eve into. Once he turned them into beasts, he took dominion over them. So Satan claimed that man would become gods, knowing good and evil. It is a statement of literal fact. When Satan did not tell Eve what it was, what his definition of God meant. The word gods is Elohim, and it means, among other things, supreme ruler, magistrate, ruler, or judge. Satan is telling Eve that if she eats of this fruit, she will become a judge over what is good and what is evil. She herself will be the supreme ruler within her own awareness. This knowledge will make her a god. This is a true statement of fact, for if we have full spectrum experiential knowledge of both good and evil, then we have a comparative basis. Because man was created with central or core awareness of existence, the great I am that sits upon the throne of self becomes the ruler of judge of all issues of morality and ethics. So full spectrum good, the self, the great I am God, full spectrum evil. Okay? It's getting better because you're starting to get the idea. You should start getting the idea of what you were turned into and what followed you and what has to be reversed. From the graph, it became quite clear that there is a neutral zone between the two forces of good and evil. This is where the great I am of the self sits upon the throne as judge and God, and that's exactly what goes on every single freaking day. All issues of morality and ethics are made on the basis of comparative analysis. Man becomes a living computer with the ability to examine fully the issue and make a choice. Herein lies the great danger. He becomes separate, a ruler unto himself. And because he has no absolute standards by which to judge, he begins to drift further and further away from any absolute standards whatever. The so-called new morality of today is nothing more than the immorality of yesterday. He then develops a whole new system of morality and ethics called situational ethics. He declares there is no right or wrong, no real good or evil. And because there is no real good or evil, there is no real sin. Sin then becomes a figment of the imagination. God becomes a figment of the imagination. So each race, tribe, or nation of man forms their own codes of conduct, each based upon their own interpretation of relative righteousness, based upon their life, a situation in life. Thus, when the Arabs, for example, slay a princess in public for adultery, those tribes of men that do not agree with this code of conduct are outraged by this act. Likewise, the Arabs are outraged at what they consider lax standards in the West and in Western culture. Japan bashing is in thing right now. The Americans were outraged at the remarks of some Japanese rulers on the American work ethic. All of these arguments have a root of relative righteousness, relative interpretations. So the move of Antichrist is to claim that there's no real truth to measure by. And if that's the case, you got to realize that that's dangerous. It is a Masonic creed that all religions have good in them, and no religion is correct, for there is no such thing as absolute truth. Therefore, all forms of religion, all forms of government, all forms of beliefs are wholly acceptable, except one, that there is one knowable absolute truth. So if there's no knowable absolute truth, all other religions are okay, except for that one. I'll read this paragraph and we'll go ahead and end. This is be the end of part 22. Satan cannot allow a man to develop any concept that would point the fact of that there being a single, knowable, absolute truth behind the universe. For this concept to be allowed to develop would put the lie into the multitude of so-called truths that Satan has developed over the centuries. It would give man an anchor that was outside of himself. He would then have this one truth by which to gauge the authenticity of all other truths. Satan's plan would fall to the ground in ruin. Okay, that'll be the end of part 22, and we'll see you on part 23.